Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University School of Gender and Development Studies, SOGDS. Postgraduate Diploma in Women's. Class as a category of division in our society has further detrimental effects when seen from a gendered lens. Besides feminist debates on class, we will also look at how women are treated as a reserve army of labor and what is the feminist perspective on domestic labor. It is important to locate these ideas within a historical context. Therefore, you will read about the historical context of gender and class with respect to the industrialized world of Europe and how it influences Indian society. 6.2 Learning Outcomes. After studying this unit, you should be able to explain the relationship between feminism and Marxism, describe the theoretical formulations on class and gender, analyze the role of gender and class in industrial Europe, and examine the role of gender and class in Indian context. 6.3 Background. In the 19th and 20th centuries, three major struggles against inequality dominated relations within and between societies. On the question of economic inequalities within societies, a question that gained increasing importance with the development of industrial capitalism and the increasing gap between the rich and the poor. B. On the question of imagined differences between peoples based on the color of their skin or their location within unequal terms of global trade, leading, for instance, to colonization of major parts of Asia, Africa and Australia by a few countries of the industrialized West, as well as an immense global mobilization of labor. And C. On the question of the discrimination against and denial of opportunities to women in relation to men, a problem common to almost countries but taking very different forms in different historical and cultural settings. A major concern of social theory in these two long centuries has been to understand the relationship between these three different relationships of inequality, to analyze their intersections, to explore possible commonalities and dissonances, and to seek ways of linking the struggles against them. In these endeavors, there have not always been agreements. While most social theories see links between these three forms of domination, they disagree not only about the nature of these linkages but also regarding their relative explanatory force and the path towards their resolution. From the late 19th century, there have been many debates about how class differences complicate women's demand for equality. At that time, the women's movement was focused on the realization of rights like those of education, employment, property and the vote, which were seen as primarily the concern of middle-class women. Even though the demands were made on behalf of all women, women who were active in the leftist movements of the time, now called Marxist feminists, regarded the concerns of working-class women, better wages and working conditions to be more urgent and to be striven for within the framework of socialist struggles. An equal society, it was believed, would also mean the end of discrimination against women. Women, leaders at the forefront of the struggle for the vote, often labeled liberal feminists, were not willing to defer their immediate concerns to the long-term goals of socialism. The debate between sex and class became more intense in the second phase of the women's movement, which began in the 1960s. By this time, socialist revolutions in many countries, beginning with Russia, had taken place, and the prediction that women would in such conditions achieve equality with men was proved wrong. Moreover, a strand of radical feminists were arguing that patriarchy predated class and was more fundamental in understanding social inequality. There were long arguments about the relative analytical primacy of sex and class. In this context, one strand of feminist thinkers sought to reconceptualize the relationship between women and class. Their distinctive contribution was the dual systems theory, which sought to deploy sex and class in interrelationship without granting primacy to either. The classification of these different varieties of feminist thought has not been without controversy. At one time, the earlier generation of feminists, who worked within socialist movements, was termed socialist feminists, while the thinkers who sought to reconcile sex and class analysis in the 1960s and 70s were called Marxist feminists. In recent years, the terms have been used in the reverse, since the earlier feminists, it is argued, were more committed to a specific Marxist line of analysis giving primacy to class, while the later feminists took a broader view of socialist theory. Some commentators prefer the term socialist feminism for the entire body of feminist thought developed in relationship to class analysis. This terminological debate can sometimes cause undue confusion. For the purpose of this unit, the last position is adopted, i.e., the term socialist feminism is used for all these strands of analysis, the conceptual basis of some of which is discussed in brief below. Now that we have a better understanding of the background against which struggles in opposition to inequality were taking shape, let us begin by looking at some early debates linking feminism with Marxism. 6.4 Feminism and Marxism, Early Debates. The idea of women's inequality came to public attention in 1792, with the publication of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women. She argued in favor of equality between women and men on the basis of a common rational capacity. Her feminist vision came together with the thinking of a number of utopian socialists, whose vision of an egalitarian society included sexual equality in the family and in society at large. These thinkers were seeking to understand and overturn the divisions between rich and poor that had arisen in consequence of the industrialization in many of the countries of Western Europe. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels sought, for the first time, to place the question of social inequality within a broader theoretical framework of history and social change, and thereby to provide a basis for realization of an equal society, termed scientific socialism or communism. This theory provided a vantage for questioning and challenging all forms of social hierarchies. It is thus that Marx's idea, or Marxism, has had a deep influence on feminism, even though the relationship between the two has been contentious. It should be noted that though the term class has been deployed in many different ways, it is Karl Marx's notion of class and class struggle framed within his theory of scientific socialism, which has been the most influential. What was Marx's distinctive contribution? He adopted an approach called historical materialism to show that successive modes of production, such as slavery, feudalism, or capitalism, are each constituted by a distinctive relationship, class, between the direct producers and the owners of the means of productions, who appropriate the major share of the production, in each case leading to a distinctive form of social conflict, class struggle, and thus to social change, to another mode of production. Box number 6.1. Oppression and exploitation are common to all class societies, but the form this takes depends on the mode in which the owners of the means of production appropriate the surplus of the labor of the direct producers, and these arrangements also inform the corresponding specific forms of the state. The appropriators are thus the oppressors, the ruling class, and the direct producers are the oppressed, or exploited, the ruled. As a further step, Marx argues that while social organizations and cultural expressions may exhibit infinite variations depending on their specific historical context, they are linked to a specific mode of production. In his analysis, therefore, the economic basis has an explanatory primacy and class struggle is the engine of social change. This is why Marx was criticized for economic determinism and why Marxists sought to explain women's inequality in terms of and through class differentiation. The one mode of production that Marx himself analyzed in great detail was capitalism. He understood it as a unique historical form aimed at the maximization of profit in a competitive market system, based on wage labor. The owners of capital, capitalists, strive towards higher productivity of labor. In capitalism, labor is not only legally free but also proletarianized, i.e., free of any means of production. Unable to produce their own subsistence, laborers are forced to work for capitalists, who pay them enough to live on and appropriate what is left, the surplus. The surplus is transformed into profit for capitalists, and this drives the system. Given the centrality of wage labor in this analysis, it is on the relations of labor and capital that Marx focused. His collaborator, Friedrich Engels, however, wrote an enormously influential tract called The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, 1884, using historical materialism to understand the development of family and the nature of women's labor. Though the book was published after Marx's death, it is supposed to be based on notes that Engels and Marx made on the research of anthropologist Louis Henry Morgan, who had published Ancient Society in 1877. It is thus considered a pivotal text in Marxist theory. In The Origin, Engels historicizes the family, tracing its origin to the rise of class society. In his view, like the state, the family emerged to serve the interest of a small ruling class, seeking to maintain control over their property. In pre-class societies, women and men enjoyed unrestricted sexual freedom, a system he called heterism. In such a society, there was no means of determining fatherhood. Consequently, he argues, descent could only be traced by the female line in compliance with maternal law, and this was universally practiced by all the nations of antiquity. In such a society, women as mothers received a high tribute of respect and deference, amounting to a women's rule, gynecocracy. Moreover, in these pre-class hunter-gatherer societies, women were usually in charge of the gathering and growing of crops. The work performed by women was central to the group's survival, and therefore valued highly. With the accumulation of surplus, came the rise in private property, and men came to control the sphere of production. The monogamous family became the means by which property could be passed down from generation to generation. Marriage was little more than a property relationship. As the demand for surplus increased, so did the demand for labor. Women were now required to produce more children to perform more labor. Marriage was a means of ensuring paternity as well as tying women to the household. The division of labor between men and women did not change, but production was moved out of the household. Household management lost its public character and became private service. The wife became, in Engels' words, the head servant, excluded from all participation in social production. Engels, 1884. Given that the exclusion from social production and the control over her reproduction was the basis of women's oppression within the monogamous family, a crucial element in Engels' argument is that capitalism, through the processes of proletarianization, draws women back into the mainstream of productive activity as wage labor. This is a positive development, since it takes them out of the isolation of the household and forms the basis for a more egalitarian family, where men and women both participate in wage earning. This also provides the basis for the argument that socialism would be liberating for women already established as workers. On both these counts, Engels has been proved wrong. Nowhere have working-class families been noticeably egalitarian. And socialism, when it came, did not lead either to the abolition of the monogamous family or to the emancipation of women. Engels, feminists have argued, underestimated the powerful role of ideology underpinning women's inequality. His predictions, moreover, have been the basis of a strand of socialist feminism, which considers class struggle to be more important than a feminist movement. Most feminists are suspicious of such a strategy. However, his insights inspired an early generation of socialist feminists. Perhaps the most important leaders of early socialism were Alexandra Kollontai, Russia, Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg, Germany. In the next section, let's us look at some later developments in socialist feminism. 6.5 Feminism and Marxism, some later theoretical formulations. In the 1960s, radical feminists concluded that Marxism had failed as a theory of history and a theory of oppression because it did not account for the origins, structure and dynamic of male domination, and it did not recognize women's oppression as fundamental. They rejected Marxism as a basis for understanding women's oppression and socialism as a viable vehicle for social change. In response, some socialist feminists, who acknowledged this critique of Marxism as valid but nevertheless wished to retain its insights in the struggle against capitalism, sought to address feminist concerns with Marxist theoretical tools. Feminist theorists, who have worked within the Marxist theoretical framework, have drawn heavily on the Engelsian paradigm to focus particularly on questions of women's work. Several insights have emerged from this rich body of research. A. Women work as unpaid housewives and mothers, thereby subsidizing the capitalist system indirectly. B. Since women provide many services at relatively low cost for their male partners, male workers are willing to accept lower wages for their own work. And C. Women are more likely than men to be employed in low-paid jobs within the capitalist system, and men are more likely than women to own private property within the capitalist system. Two of the very influential theses developed in this context are discussed below. Women as reserve army of labor. The domestic labor debate. 6.6 Women as reserve army of labor. This thesis is associated with the writings of Veronica Beachy, though many others have also contributed to this debate. According to Marx, capitalist economies fluctuate, causing increased demands for labor during economic booms and reduced demands for labor during economic slumps. Capitalists seek flexibility to vary employment levels in accordance with these economic fluctuations. At any particular time, the existence of a reserve army of labor increases competition for jobs and helps to depress average wage levels. According to Veronica Beachy, 1977, women are the more significant part of the reserve army of labor, and this helps to explain the disadvantaged employment situation of some women. The theory assumes that it is easier to dismiss women or ask them to work part-time during a recession and then to re-employ them during a boom because they are prepared to return to their traditional housewife-mother role. They can still rely on the husband's wage as the main source of income for the family because in any case men are better Paid, women's part-time jobs are less likely to be covered fully by redundancy legislation. This theory has been challenged on empirical and theoretical grounds. Recent research has shown that fluctuations in women's employment have not always followed the logic of economic cycles. In fact, moving the spotlight to countries other than advanced capitalisms of the West reveals very different relations between men and women to the labor market. Even more importantly, it has not proved possible to establish whether women's labor functions causally as a reserve army of labor or whether such a theory explains women's inequality in the labor force. 6.7 The domestic labor debate. This debate began with Margaret Benston's classic article, The Political Economy of Women's Liberation, 1969, in which she used a Marxist analytical framework to understand household labor. It was an attempt to derive an explanation of the oppression of women from the labor theory of value, linking housework to the accumulation of capital. Women's unpaid labor in the home is seen as functional for the accumulation process. Maria Dalla Costa and Selma James, 1972, argued that the housewife produces labor power people who can sell their labor to employers, hence reproduction. This makes the family a social factory, creating, through procreation, and maintaining, through domestic work, labor power that is vital to capitalism. According to Costa and James, women are the slaves of the wage slaves. Wally Seacombe argued that domestic labor is an example of what Marx called unproductive labor, that is, domestic labor produces labor power, and hence indirectly produces surplus value for capitalists who hire that labor power. 1974. In addition, he comments that since women are physically isolated at home and exploited indirectly, they have less power to change society than men. This has been an enormously influential debate, raising a number of related theoretical questions and campaign issues such as the meaning of family wage, the valuation of work and payment for housework. Further empirical explorations have shown the complex interrelationships between productive work and household work in different historical contexts, since even capitalism does not always affect a clear separation of the two. Indeed, this debate has led to serious rethinking of the definition of work itself, productively stretching classical Marxist concepts. 6.8 The dual systems approach. In the mid-1970s, a group of socialist feminists sought to synthesize Marxist and radical feminist theory into a viable theory of social reality and, especially, women's oppression. Their efforts led to what became known as the dual systems theory. This followed from recognition of the significance of reproduction in understanding not only capitalism but any mode of production. Further, this called for a theoretical reformulation of Marxism itself. According to the dual systems theory, women's oppression arises from two distinct and relatively autonomous systems: patriarchy, system of male dominance, which produces specific gender oppression of women, and the system of mode of production, which produces class oppression and determines the appropriation of the surplus value of women's work. Patriarchy in relation with the specific mode of production, say, capitalism, produces the concrete phenomenon of women's oppression in society. Indeed, a notion of capitalist patriarchy has been central to the dual systems approach. The dual systems approach emphasized the relationship of men and women to central aspects of production and reproduction. Linda Phelps's Patriarchy and Capitalism was one of the earliest statements of this approach, arguing that patriarchy operates as a system parallel to capitalism. The two are distinct systems of oppression and their histories and principles of authority are different. In her view, the two reinforce each other, but are also at times in contradiction with one another. Phelps, 1975. Ziller. Eisenstein, one of the major exponents of this theory, lays more emphasis on how the two systems support one another. Eisenstein, 1979. The dual systems approach has probably been most cogently elaborated in the work of Heidi Hartman, who has shown that in modern societies, capitalists have not always been able to bend patriarchy to their own interests. Hartman, 1981. The most significant achievement of the dual systems theory was to direct attention to phenomena beyond the production process that were nevertheless central to understanding contemporary society. The theory yielded, as a result, some very rich historical and sociological research. It has been criticized, however, on multiple counts. First, it grafts a theory of gender relations onto existing Marxist theory without sufficiently examining or reformulating its assumptions. Second, the theory allows only the play of two categories, class and gender. How can it accommodate other relations of hierarchy? such as race, just as patriarchy and capitalism has been accorded autonomy to prevent one from being reduced to the other categories like race, caste, heterosexism demand equivalent explanatory force. A solution along the same lines, a multiplication of systems of oppression, would not be analytically productive. The primary question, how different forms of oppressions are related, remains unanswered in such a framework. In the section which follows, we will take a more in-depth look at the interplay between gender and class. 6.9 The discursive shift, gender and class. Up to the early 1980s, feminists used the term woman, or, if they needed a category, sex, to talk about difference. The problem was, however, that this made it difficult to distinguish between biological differences, usually also called sex, and what feminists called the social construction of sexual difference. The point had by then been made quite emphatically, starting with Simone de Beauvoir's insightful statement that one is not born a woman but becomes one, Beauvoir, 1949. To overcome the naturalizing consequences of terminology such as woman or sex, a need was felt for a term that would in itself signal social construction, i.e., a discursive category. The term gender, once introduced, became popular very quickly and had long-term consequences for feminist intellectual projects. In Unit 2 of Block 1, you have already been introduced to some of the distinctions between sex and gender. Before moving ahead, you may find it useful to review to what you have already learnt in the earlier unit. One major advantage of the term gender was that it did not denote embodied subjects and thus did not have the same implications in case of plural and additive categories. And, moreover, it laid to rest some of the debates over the primacy of one category over another. With the gradual acceptance of the insights of post-structuralism, similar shifts were taking place in the understanding of class, from E.P. Thompson's seminal intervention in the 1960s advocating the understanding of class as experience. Thompson, 1963, to Gareth Stedman Jones's attempt to trace the development of a language of class, Jones, 1983, to Patrick Joyce's exploration of class as a discursive category, Joyce, 1995, theories of the origin of class and class consciousness were considerably altered. In the 1990s, the emphasis was on class as identity. It was now possible to explore the ways in which relationships of oppression, race, class and gender, for instance, were constituted in reference to each other in different historical contexts. It is difficult to overemphasize the impact of post-structuralism and postmodernism in the current academic environment. The reformulation of class, notwithstanding Marxist methods and insights that informed class analysis, have receded into the background. In this context, the gender versus class debate, a hugely productive intellectual project in its time, seems to have been laid to rest. In the 1990s, however, a group of socialist feminists tried to give postmodernist theory some grounding in social realities. Said in the inverse, this means that they have attempted to bring the tools and methods of discourse analysis within the ambit of socialist feminism. The term often used for such theorization is materialist feminism. Though it is difficult to pin the term down with any great precision, the term was first used in the mid-1970s by Christine Delphi, drawing on socialist and Marxist feminism. Delphi, 1979, The Grand Domestic Revolution by Dolores Hayden, which described material feminism as reconceptualizing the relationship between the private household space and public space by presenting collective solutions to housework, cooking, and other traditional female domestic jobs, was a forerunner to Hayden. 1982. At present, the most closely associated with the terms are Rosemary Hennessy and Chris Ingraham, who are editors of Materialist Feminism, A Reader in Class, Difference, and Women's Lives. They describe material feminism as the conjuncture of several discourses such as historical materialism, Marxist and radical feminism, as well as postmodern and psychoanalytic theories. Hennessy, Conditions on the Social Construction of Gender, and on an Understanding of Gender Hierarchy as relational and multiple and not in itself simply exhaustive. Thus, the aim is not just a formulation of an arena of female difference or differences but also a conceptualization of multiple axes of difference, moving beyond the additive logic of female differences to a grounded understanding of gender in relation to other categories. Such an understanding includes the possibility that in given instances, gender is not the only foundational category. This said, let us begin to look at some specific contexts within which the categories of gender and class get defined in the historical terms. 6.10 Historical Note: Gender and Class in Industrializing Europe. Much of the debates about gender and class have been elaborated in the context of the transformative impact of industrial capitalism in Western Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Industrial Revolution is considered a major watershed in the organization of work because of the introduction of the factory system, which affected a separation between the home and the workplace. In pre-capitalist societies, the household was the locus of production, reproduction and consumption, of work and leisure. Productive labor was organized through the family with its attendant gender and generational hierarchies. The factory system involved two significant changes: the removal of productive work from the ambit of the home and new forms of hierarchization. Skill and supervision, for instance, of labor, which drew on gender and generation, but were not premised on familial relationships. These changes were coded in a discursive formation, known as the separation of spheres, which involved a series of overlapping binaries: home and work, family and state, private and public, reproduction and production, and women and men. Gender was thus fundamentally implicated in the social imaginary of post-industrial societies. In concrete terms, there were several social consequences for women. The Industrial Revolution gave rise to a capitalist class, better known as the middle class. Among the middle classes, men were engaged in entrepreneurial, managing and professional work, while the women were relegated to the reproductive domain of the home. In the 19th century, there emerged a powerful ideology of femininity based on this perception of the unproductive housewife, which carried two distinct but interrelated images. The woman as the angel in the house was pure, asexual, submissive yet morally superior and responsible for upholding and preserving familial, social and spiritual values, and the leisured lady spent a life of idleness and frivolity confined to the domestic sphere, devoted to leisure, purchased through employment of domestic servants or at best accessing unproductive public activity like social work. At the lower end of the social scale, industrialization meant the participation of large numbers of women and children in factories and workshops. Even though there was a substantial participation of married women in such work, the abiding stereotype is that of the factory girl, the young unmarried woman, who worked in factories for a few years, enabling her to collect some resources towards marriage and her own household. Poor women's participation in wage work evoked two diametrically opposite responses in society. On the one hand, there were the pessimists who felt that factory work eliminated the possibility of a flexible adjustment between productive and reproductive work. Consequently, wage work by married women jeopardized housework and childcare. In case of young unmarried women, wage work disrupted patterns of domestic training and undermined patriarchal authority. The visibility of women's work and the outcry against the exploitative nature of the work and the social harm resulting from it led to a series of inquiries, such as in Britain in the 1830s and 1840s. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, most Western European countries enacted legislation to protect women workers and to regulate their work in factories in the interests of family and child care. On the other hand, however, there were those who were optimistic of women's participation in factory production, predicting on the lines of Friedrich Engels that wage work, in giving women a new sense of economic independence, would allow them to bargain for more rights within family and society. Recent research on industrialization in Europe raises doubts about many of these abiding stereotypes. One central question asked by feminist scholars is whether the separation of the private and public, home and workplace has been emphasized too much. In fact, industrial capitalism in Europe is not coterminous with the factory system. Apart from the overwhelming presence of small workshops, there was a continuing practice of home working among women, for whom their home was their workplace. The majority of women workers were in the sweated trades, where they earned significantly lower wages. Factory women were a small minority of early industrial populations. The gender segregation in the labor market sharpened the already existing division of labor between men and women, and skill became designated as a masculine domain, women being defined as unskilled or semi-skilled. It may be argued, therefore, that for women, the great continuity across the industrialization divide was domestic work. All women, whether they were employed or not, remained responsible for domestic work. Many women continued to combine productive and domestic work within the home. And, most importantly, the greatest increases in women's employment was in paid domestic work. The female domestic servant was the most striking feature of early Industrial societies, the maid toiling below stairs, in affluent middle-class homes or in the aristocracy's town and country houses, or general servants in households of tradesmen, shopkeepers and artisans, or in the new suburbs, constituted the largest single group of women workers. As such, domestic labor, paid or unpaid, also provides the most potent theoretical challenge to established understandings of industrial capitalism. In some of the literature of industrialization, the separation between private and public has been taken too literally. The physical separation of the home and the workplace did not result in the linking the two. The importance of family in determining labor use and arrangements remained. The industrial economy cannot be understood without reference to changing constitution of family, relations of power and authority within the family, and their influence on processes and structures of production outside the home. Moreover, the division between the worlds of men and women was not a single process or a settled arrangement. The nature of such division varied across social groups and changed over time. In 19th century England, for instance, the separation of spheres became a major plank of class identity. Middle-class women could afford not to work outside the home, while working-class women were forced to. Over time, however, the values of feminine domesticity spread across much of the working class in Western Europe. As skilled men organized themselves in trade unions, they sought to expel from the workforce women and children, who exerted a downward pressure on wages. The notion of a family wage, which found increasing favor among trade unions and even the state, upheld the ideology of a single male breadwinner with a family of unproductive wife and children. The result was the domestication of working class women. On the one hand, women in socialist movements sought improvements in their wages and working conditions. On the other, socialist movements upheld working class struggles for family wage, which resulted in women's exclusion from factory work. None of these, therefore, were unidirectional changes. At the time when working class women were being domesticated, middle class women, exhausted from unalloyed leisure, began to access the new opportunities presented by an industrializing society. They began to access education and employment, and, learning from their experience in charity and social work, organized themselves to demand a variety of rights such as that of public activity, dress reform, public association, property, divorce, representation, culminating in the demand for the vote. This last led to the suffragette movement, led by the middle classes but with differing degrees of support from socialist and working class women. Meanwhile, the outbreak of the First World War cost European countries dearly in the life of men. While the men fought and died, women were called upon to provide labor for agricultural and factory production. When the war ended and the men returned from the front, women were asked to return to their homes, to their housewifery and mothering. Many women did indeed do so, but their experience of work and self-sufficiency had unalterably changed the fabric of social life. Not only did they earn the right to vote in many Western countries at the close of the war, their presence in the public domain increased considerably. New winds of change came again with the Second World War. This time too women were called upon to aid the war effort, not only as hands on the land and in the factories, but at the war front as well, as drivers, nurses and administrators. In the aftermath of the war, in the following 2 decades, women became active participants in the radical politics of Europe, which heralded the emergence of new feminism in the 1960s. This was a period of expanding women's employment. After the war, governments began to play a more active role in the protection and promotion of the economic and social well-being of the citizens. The welfare state in its current form came into being in many advanced industrialized countries of the West. At the same time, labor movements grew in strength and were able to negotiate better working conditions and more security of employment. Individual manufacturers found increasingly large factories and a huge workforce restricted their ability to adjust to the vagaries of fluctuating international markets. In the 1970s, thus, manufacturers began to relocate the more labor-intensive part of their production to countries where labor was cheaper and more docile. Thus, manufacturing began to cross national boundaries, and production in the assembly lines gave way to assembling parts made in distant global locations. This new international division of labor led to what is now called a feminization of manufacturing workforce on a global scale. In the 1970s, some of the Southeast Asian countries emerged as the workshops of the world, and the workers in these new manufacturing centers were predominantly women. In the next section, we will learn more about what this implied in the context of India. 6.11 The Indian case. The idea of industrialization as a blueprint for economic development remained dominant up to the 1960s. In the next few decades, however, the understanding of development and the role industrialization may or may not play in it was revised considerably. First, it came to be acknowledged that the nature of industrialization in the Western countries was premised largely on their ability to command resources in the colonies. Second, the decolonization of regions of Asia and Africa had major implications for the future economic development of erstwhile imperial countries of Western Europe. Third, the newly independent countries were faced with the problems of development from a severely disadvantaged position because they had been plundered in different ways by the imperial powers, but they had no similar external resource to smoothen their path. And fourth, economically backward countries faced the additional difficulty of a late start because they now had to compete with advanced industrialized and developed economies. In 1947, on achieving independence, India too was confronted with these myriad questions of development. 3 decades later, in the mid-1970s, with the publication of Towards Equality, 1975, it became clear that these were not gender-neutral issues. These seemingly general problems had quite different and distinct implications for women and men. In India, industrial capitalism had been introduced under the aegis of the colonial state. In the late 19th century, there were factories starting with mass products such as jute and cotton, but after the First World War expanding to infrastructure goods such as iron and steel, chemicals and engineering as well. There were mines. Coal and irons were the most important, but the range included precious metals, gold and silver, copper, bauxite and many others. There were also large-scale plantations, tea in Assam and North Bengal and coffee in southern India. Moreover, burgeoning urban centers attracted labor for a range of industries and services: construction, docks, transportation, petty trading, personal services and others. While these workers remained a small enclave within an overwhelmingly rural population, agriculture was being commercialized through international trade in primary products. Markets were being integrated as a result of political and administrative unification as well as through improved communications such as the expanding railways network. Thus, while peasant agriculture continued to be predominant, there was a steep increase of wage labor in agriculture. These new laboring arrangements were grafted onto existing relations of family, caste and community and showed strongly marked gender and generational patterns. In the urban and industrial sector, women and children were marginal to begin with and their numbers dwindled over time. By the 1930s, these industries began to be regulated by the state and their labor organized in trade unions. In the next 20 years, they came be marked out as a small but core, formal sector, of which women had a negligible share. In the plantations, women had a nearly equitable share of employment, even though they were paid poorly for back-breaking work. In the countryside, in contrast, women's and children's unpaid labor was engaged more intensely than earlier, since on this depended the survival of small peasants squeezed by the pressures of rent and revenue. On the whole, in this period, the paid component of women's labor decreased, while its unpaid component increased.
The exclusion of women from the formal sector did not mean the domestication of women except for a small group of wives and daughters of formal sector workers, unionized laborers earning family wages. Most other poor women had to work harder than ever, either as unpaid household workers or in the informal sector where their labor was subject to intense exploitation for poor returns. In the 1990s, when the Indian state embarked on a course of liberalization, the small and exclusive character of formal sector labor became a political flashpoint. India, many feared, would experience the same feminization of labor evident in some of the Southeast Asian countries. Women would undercut the benefits achieved by organized male labor over a century of struggle. 30 years after the onset of liberalization, it is now clear that the gender pattern of the Indian workforce remains intact. The formal workforce is a little less than 10% of the country's total, and women have considerably less of that share. Women continue to flock in the informal sector. In South Asia, where seclusion and segregation of the sexes encoded in the Purdah system was an organizing social principle, class and caste played major roles in determining what work women could do. Usually, the avoidance of visible and manual work by women was a mark of elite status, while the public appearance of women, especially for work, underlined low caste and social status. Meanwhile, in the 19th century, a new colonial service and professional middle class emerged in the urban centers of the country. Their women began to access education and, very soon, began to aspire to similar service and professional employment as their men. Beginning as a small trend, this was expanded after independence. Ever since the liberalization of the 1990s, new and better job opportunities have emerged for educated middle-class women. The expansion in educated women's employment has become one of the more striking social developments in the last 20 years. Thus, similar processes have had opposite effect for middle-class and poor women. The former have by and large gained in terms of expanded education and employment opportunities, while the latter have been pushed into more intensive labor for lower returns. Exploring such intersecting and divergent patterns of gender and class provides new insights into the story of modern India's development. 6.12 Summary. In this unit we have tried to understand the relationship between gender and class based on theoretical insights gained from Marxism and feminism. Initially, it was believed that women's emancipation would follow from the end of capitalist exploitation and the transition to socialism. From the 1960s, we have had a much more nuanced understanding of this relationship, and theorists have explored how the dynamics of patriarchy work within capitalism and socialism. In recent years, feminists have tried to move away from a gender and class binary to try to accommodate multiple axes of oppression, such as caste and race. We have also seen how Industrial Revolution changed the nature of women's work and altered the balance between their productive and reproductive work to give rise to new categories of women workers. The creation of a category of middle-class women resulted in their making new demands for social and political rights, giving rise to incipient feminist movements across many societies. The impact of capitalist industrialization was somewhat different in the colonial context. In India, for instance, industrialization directly affected only a small proportion of women, though capitalist developments affected the lives and work of much wider segment of the female population. Over a long historical period, class differences among women have sharpened, providing the background for current processes of globalization. Thank you.